You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Hello, Jamie.
Hello, Peter.
Who are we talking about today?
Josh Reppun today.
By the way, you look good for someone who's been moving.
My God, I'm so tired.
Who moves in a button-down shirt?
You do.
I know.
Yeah, and a
He totally
cardigan,
knows.
likely. Likely. You probably would run a marathon in a button-down shirt.
Yes. When I do wear a T-shirt, there's a family friend, their daughter calls me Vacay Pete if she ever sees me T-shirt.
Oh my God. I want to make T-shirts that say Vacay Pete now. I have a picture of it. It's you in flip-flops on a beach with a T-shirt and a cardigan. Hey, I actually have a fun question to open with. You say during episodes of the podcast, during the interview, that I think is really interesting. And I just super noticed it with Josh, where you say, so if you're just joining us, my guest is...
Oh, I had changed it to our guest in other spots. In newer
I said the my. That one actually doesn't
Oh.
bother me at all. Whatever.
Oh, okay.
It's the... Who's just joining you at that point?
Sometimes people just, they tune in later.
What do you mean they're doing it later? Who goes, you know what?
They hit
Oh, no,
30
it's the podcast,
seconds.
but I
They
wanna
go,
start at the
they go,
12-minute mark.
Peter and Jamie seem fun. I'm just going to go 30 seconds. I don't know. I listen to like Fresh Air, and even in the middle, they just say,
There's
just joining us.
commercials in the
Just
middle.
joining us. Now, sometimes people don't even know they've just come in later on. But yeah, okay.
Fresh
You're
Air does that because it's a live radio show.
If you're just joining us, maybe you've just woken up from a coma and you've had our podcast
Exactly.
just running.
You've been running this
running
podcast since
endlessly.
you've been in a coma.
Right.
There have been 3 years.
If you're just joining us, you're alive.
You're alive.
Mhm.
If you're just
Have
joining
you
us,
ever
it's like,
watched a
who's
movie
just
that...
joining us?
All right. If you're just joining us, my co-host is a jerk. And you already knew that, I'm sure, from the very beginning of this.
Oh, he just notices these things. He notices the little things.
I'm going
That's what
to
I
start
noticed.
every sentence with "you're just joining us" for the rest of our conversation. If you're just joining us, I have a question for Jamie. Have you ever watched a movie that influenced you as much as Most Likely to Succeed influenced our guest today, Josh Reppun?
No. Movie? No.
It was really interesting how influential this movie was for him and really has created this new pathway for him to have such an influence on schools and what schools could be, and such amazing guests that he has on his own podcast. So I thought that was kind of interesting. It actually reminds me of, so there's this big film festival in Columbia, Missouri called the True False Film Festival. And we used to send all of our 10th graders, so 1,200 10th graders would go each year. And they would typically work with us to figure out what movie we were going to show the kids. And so, the year that they did the James Baldwin documentary about, it was called I'm Not Your Negro, like that was a really important one that we did a lot of planning for. The Won't You Be My Neighbor was the Mr. Rogers one. Bully was a fantastic one. There was one year that they wanted to show us one where, I can't even remember the name, but it was like some Chechen rebel who had like a fatwa against him, and they said they were going to have to do a bomb sweep of the school, and he was staying in a safe house and he had private security. And I was like, and they wanted him to come visit the school to talk to the kids about the movie. I was like, time out. What? Like, no, we're not doing that. So we rewatched Won't You Be My Neighbor that year. But
You've told me that story. I remember
I
that
know.
story.
You don't have to repeat that I told you the story. Because if you're just joining us, some of you have not listened to that story from previous episodes. I'm feisty today, Jamie.
Oh my goodness gracious.
Fired
Okay,
up.
well, innovation, which is his theme, is not yours today. I really liked how you opened with Josh, and it had me buzzing about a particular question. You said he's a former hotel manager, history teacher, retail sales specialist, and his official title today is what school could be global community director. So good. So good. And so it had me ask 2 questions. One, and I love this question when I talk to people about it because I think it's so interesting. How many other jobs, or what are the other jobs you've had in your life before superintendent? And then second, is there a job or profession you wish you would have done or could do now?
Well, that's a great question. So
Thank you.
if you're
You're just joining us.
If you're just joining us, I'm going to
asked
answer the
an
question.
amazing
Just joining us. I would say I thought that there would be a number of jobs that people have had before they became a superintendent, that in the first season, I asked everyone, tell me about your journey to becoming a superintendent. And what I realized was almost everyone had been a counselor, and then they were a teacher, and then principal, assistant soup. And so then I started asking people, have you had any, before the interview, hey, I'm just kind of curious about your own work. Did you ever join, like, were you in the circus or anything interesting before? Because otherwise it's just a waste of time to ask people what their jobs have been. So I would tell you my jobs. Did some like internships in finance. I painted numbers poorly on sidewalks for the fire
That's
department.
fun.
I caddied, which was horrible. God,
That might be the best question. Like, what's the worst job you've ever had? That's more fun.
Oh, I was in an a cappella singing group
Oh, that's
for a summer, 2 summers.
And you made money doing it.
Oh yeah, it was amazing. 10 guys. We rented the house all together. We sang at Walter Cronkite's house, and Beverly Sills was there, and Lady Bird Johnson taught us "The Eyes of Texas Are Upon You." Yeah, those were some really fun jobs. One job that I think was probably one of the most profound experiences, at least it's one that I use all the time with my own children, which is my father, who started his own business. I asked if I could work for him. And so he said, sure. And so the first day I show up for work and they tell me that I'm actually working in the basement of another building. So I go to that basement and there's instructions about just filing, just taking all these boxes, all these files and putting them in the right files because it's their off-site filing area. And I did that and I came home somewhat despondent. He said, how was your first day? And I said, it was terrible. I'm in this basement, like filing things. It's cold. It's terrible down there.
Yeah.
And he looked at me and said, did you think I was going to make you vice president on the first day? I mean, my kids, sometimes they apply for, like, they run for office for certain things. They're like, how did I not win president? And I'm like, did you think you were going to be president the first day? I mean, like the first day they walk into that club and they're running for president, like they don't know anyone. They've been in a relationship. They don't know anything about the actual club. And so
good.
It's become quite a saying around this house around, you've got to pick up the broom and do the work and build credibility and build those skills so that when you are eligible for that role, people know that you're going to take it seriously, do it well, and respect the jobs that they're doing.
Exactly. Josh Reppun, his path just is so,
I know,
random from an educator's point of view. It's not random because there is no normal, right? Everybody's path is random. So that's what's normal, is the randomness of it all. I'd say that my worst job by far, I mean, I got lucky. My mom was the front office administrator for an elementary school for 34 years. And as a result of that, in true nepotism fashion, she got her son a job as a janitor on the cleaning crew starting in, God, I want to say 10th grade, during the summer of 10th grade. And I just did that for a long time, but that led to knowing people within ops in the school district. So you name the thing that has to do with the building, I've done it. I've done that job. And so the worst one was they had to re-tar the roof of an elementary school. And guess who got a mop?
Oh, that is tough.
It was horrible. It smelled horrible. I didn't know what I was doing, so I made a lot of mistakes and was wrecked. And it was hot.
You learned so much, though. You learned so much in that job.
I've done everything. We built picnic benches. They had a wood shop, and so we built benches or repaired benches. I've painted them. I've mowed the lawn. I've I've done grounds like that. I've done every single possible job. I've cleaned the toilets. I've scrubbed gum off the desks. We've done all those things, and it all gives me a sense. I feel like I have been embedded in schooling for so long, and I've had a ton of other little jobs as well, but I've been embedded in schools for so long, knowing so many different things. And the only job I haven't really had is superintendent.
Based on your description, because everything you know around curriculum instruction and teaching and learning and having worked in facilities, there's no reason why you have not been a superintendent. There's so much I didn't know.
Yeah.
If you're just joining us, we're about to go into listening to a conversation that I had with Josh Reppun. And we're
totally
so excited that you're here.
And we're glad you joined in this late in the podcast.
Where you been?
Good for you for fast forwarding the first 15 minutes of this blather.
You've been listening, and you are listening, and we hope you'll continue listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. All right, let's get going. Today on An Imperfect Leader, my guest is Josh Reppun. Now, he has been described as the What School Could Be global community evangelist. He is the host of the What School Could Be podcast. He's a former chef, he's a former hotel manager, a former history teacher, retail technology sales specialist, and his official title today is What School Could Be global community director. Josh, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
I could not be happier to be with you today, Peter. Thank you.
I am so thrilled to have you. Having been to Hawaii a few times and trying to best understand the spirit of aloha through our conversation, even before we hit record, I'm just so pleased to spend time with you. And so I can remember reaching out to you a while back and asking you to be on the show. And you wrote something like, you should really talk to Dr. Christina Kishimoto because she was the state superintendent of Hawaii. And I did that. And she was excellent, even for a Yankees fan, which is why I wore my Mets hat today, so that when she listens to this, she'll hear it and see it. And then I asked you again, hey, what about now? And you finally agreed. So I'm glad that you did. I wonder if we could start, though, about talking about your podcast. I've listened to a number of episodes. You have so many really interesting people. Would you tell us about what school could be?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Peter. And I'll say that episode with Christina Kishimoto was a knockout. I enjoyed that from one end to the other. And it was really fun to be able to post up on LinkedIn like, hey, everybody, you got to listen to this episode. And I said to people, now you're in my follow list. Your show is in my follow list. So that was really well done. So yeah, the What School Could Be podcast. So I'm going to try to be as concise as possible. The journey for me began 10 years ago after I had left teaching, 17 years teaching history and economics and Hawaiian studies here in Hawaii. And after I'd left teaching and I'd actually started to work retail at Apple here in Honolulu, it was a logical progression for me because I had always had technology in the classroom and it was always Apple technology. And so I started working retail. And then I saw 10 years ago, Most Likely to Succeed, the acclaimed documentary film produced by Ted Dintersmith and directed by Greg Whiteley. It changed the arc of my life in 90 minutes. And I'm not saying that, hyperbolically. It really did. And so eventually I got in touch with Ted, and he had already begun his 50 state tour. And the tour was going to end in Hawaii, the 50th state. And he asked me to curate his time here in the islands, which was 6 days of wild and crazy visits to some really innovative and imaginative schools, public, private, and charter here in the islands. And that began a friendship and a partnership with Ted. Subsequent to that, he wrote his book, What School Could Be. There's a lovely little section towards the back end that talks about his time in Hawaii. And so to your question, I kept thinking, is there a way to extend that chapter, knowing that he wasn't going to write another edition of the book? So how could I do that? And I tried a number of different things, including a YouTube channel. Didn't quite work. And then one night, at the end of a long shift at Apple here in Honolulu, the idea popped into my brain that the best way to extend that chapter would be through a podcast. And it turns out there was a friend of mine who was just messing around with his iPhone in the back of the story. It's just a customer. And we started talking, and I found out that he wanted to start a podcast as well. So what he brought to the game was technical expertise. What I brought to the game was a very laser-focused mission and vision, which was to elevate the stories of public, private, and charter educators and education leaders who are super imaginative, innovative, and creative here in the island. So I launched the What School Could Be podcast. Originally, it was titled What School Could Be in Hawaii, and Ryan Ozawa and I built it together. And it became one episode at a time, the extension of that chapter in the book, What School Could Be. And to my utter astonishment, Peter, the numbers on the podcast went straight through the roof right out of the gate. I had no idea that there was such a hunger out there to hear from imaginative educators.
No, I think people are craving. They are craving something different from what has been a very much a conveyor belt style of education that we all seem to be satisfied with. And you mentioned Most Likely to Succeed. I was glad I heard you speak of it in a separate conversation that you were having. So I went and watched it and was just absolutely blown away. I'm so glad I did. And there's a line at the end. I want to talk about that for a moment because one of the main, protagonists, one of the four individuals who are being profiled says, you know what, the schools are still separate. They're still unequal. And it's not said with anger or venom. It's just sort of said matter of fact. It's like, well, it's never going to be anything different. And so I'm curious, that documentary is so important to you, and it obviously launched the podcast. What are you seeing, or I guess what schools maybe come to mind that you're seeing that really are hopefully that can be that kernel of hope and that helps us begin to dream again about, what do we want to create together? One of those fundamental, compelling purpose questions that we ask our communities when we're trying to build schools.
Yeah, that's a great question, Peter. So two things. One, What School Could Be just celebrated the 10th anniversary of the debut of Most Likely to Succeed at the Sundance Film Festival. We had a virtual YouTube live session where Ted Dintersmith and Greg Whiteley got together and I hosted it. And we had an incredible conversation about how the film got made. And there were some really wonderful backstories about what was going on at High Tech High during the filming process. And so to your question, the second thing is that in the beginning, everybody thought that High Tech High was a revelation. I mean, truly, it was an epiphany for anybody who saw the film. It was like, wow, that's amazing. And what ended up happening in the short term, the next few years, was that San Diego and High Tech High became a mecca. And everybody wanted to go there to see what they were doing.
That's not an overstatement. I mean, it truly is. I mean, people were making pilgrimage to San Diego. I mean, everybody wanted to be there.
Absolutely. And High Tech High was growing. So it went from a couple of schools to now multiple, 15 or 16, I think, variations, elementary, middle, and high school at High Tech High. So what has happened since is that I've had the privilege of sitting in this perch, looking at the whole landscape of education in America. What I've watched is that variations of High Tech High have sprung up like mushrooms in a wet forest. They're all over the country, public, private, charter. And it's remarkable to see those variations. And I think one of the things that I would love to see in the future is an embrace of the variations, that we have been living in a standardized education process for more than 140 years. And it's actually in the variations, in those differentiated models, that we will find the answer to separate and unequal, right? We are going to find ways that parents and the communities and the business communities and the education communities can really come together in place, in context, to decide what's best for their kids where they are. And I'll just give you a quick example, Peter. We at What School Could Be, coming up in about a month, we're going to screen again a wonderful documentary titled Rise, Voice of a New Generation. And this is the documentary that captures One Stone Lab School in Boise, Idaho. I would say I would put Most Likely to Succeed and Rise like top two for me. And what they've done in Boise.
Have you ever seen Bad Kids by any chance? Bad Kids? Check it out.
No.
Also, you can see it on, it's also, I think you can find it on YouTube as well, but Bad Kids follows a alternative high school in California, rural, and just talking about the power of a principal and staff to really engage. And I use that as a vehicle one year for all of our staff, for our leaders. After we did our back to school sort of meeting, we all went to a movie theater and watched it. And then we had students from our alternative high school talk about why they felt why they finally felt a home in their alternative high school, and their principal and their teachers, and what was different as compared to their comprehensive high schools where they had been unsuccessful. It was probably the best. I was like, I should just be done like that because there was no other back to school meeting. Next year, like, what are we watching this year? I'm like, no, we're doing a traditional meeting. So sorry to interrupt. So, okay, Rise.
So what we're seeing across the country, I believe, and maybe people have called me naive in my relentless optimism, but I'm optimistic. And I see the cup as half full. And I think that we actually are headed in the right direction and that we are moving very quickly now towards student-driven learning and all of the variations of that concept pretty fast. And I'm hopeful and I'm energized by it. And I'll come back to your original question about the podcast. Again, part of my hope is driven by 140 episodes of my show. Every time I do a deep dive into an educator's life and work, I grow a little bit more hopeful because they're not only in America, they're all over the world. And it's a good thing. It's a really good feeling. And we got to just get under the big tent and keep pushing together.
If you're just joining us, my guest today is Josh Reppun, the host and producer of What School Could Be podcast. And I've listened to a number of episodes, and as you were describing the people you've gotten to talk to and learn from, and absolutely, I mean, you're talking about individuals who say, why shouldn't we consider paying students to write curriculum? And that was happening in Hampton, Virginia. Or what about you were talking with Andrew Culberson, who wants to build this caring and connected communities. And then I saw that you had John Hattie and Tony Frontier on your podcast. I was like, my gosh. Just as an aside, like I once tried to convince a group of teachers that we were going to have to consolidate one section we were going from 5 sections of 4th grade to 4 sections of 4th grade. And I tried to cite Hattie's research on the positive effect size for smaller class sizes, that it was 0.21, that it was not very big, and that, it was not as nearly as powerful as the effect size of highly effective teachers, 1.59, and it won't surprise you they didn't care, right?
Yeah.
So,
Right.
But to return to the people you've had on your show, it's really those who talk about inquiry-based and problem-based learning. And these have high effect sizes and much more, obviously, than smaller class sizes. But I want to put a spotlight on those two because they, along with deeper learning, they seem really important to you as a host, as an educator, and certainly it seems to be important to the podcast. And I wonder why, because I feel like you're sort of talking about that in terms of like why you're optimistic about the future.
Yeah, great question. Over the years, since Most Likely to Succeed in the development of What School Could Be and the organization now that is What School Could Be and whatschoolcouldbe.org, we have 5 themes, Peter. So mobilizing your community, student-driven learning, real-world challenges, assessments for deeper learning, and caring and connected communities. And as I develop my podcast list, that I'm actually in that active phase right now for 2025, I'm kind of booked out through May, but I'm starting to think about June through the rest of the year. These individuals, these educators and education leaders fall roughly into those 5 categories. And I look at selecting them through those lenses. So Kate Maxlow came to me through an Ed Week article, and I just happened to be scrolling through their newsletter. And what popped out at me was that something called From Hampton to Hollywood. And when I read through it, basically what she was doing in Hampton City Schools of Virginia was developing this program where kids were working directly with Hollywood producers, editors, directors to make their own films. And then the culmination, just like in Most Likely to Succeed, was a public exhibition or a film festival in which they showed their work. And I was just knocked out. And so I contacted the journalist who put me in touch with Kate, and then ended up doing that episode. And if you really want to hear an example of an educator who's relentlessly directed towards student-driven learning, Kate is right up there at the top for me of the 140 episodes. And then if you look at Andrew Culberson, who's actually in New Brunswick in Canada, his innovation, and he came to me through a recommendation from a colleague, his innovation that he was working on across the entire province, among many innovations, there was something called micro courses. So you know that micro credentials has been all the rage lately in education conversations. What Andrew was working on across the province was micro courses, meaning that teachers and students, either separately or together, could propose short courses that could either be separate from the regular, move from chemistry to biology to English to math, or it could be embedded within a course, like a chemistry course that would have a 3-week micro course that would be completely focused on real world learning. And I was just like, wow, that's amazing. And so having him on the pod was a remarkable learning journey for me. And by the way, that's the joy of doing the podcast, as I know you understand. Every time you do an episode is a learning moment, and it helps us to move from imperfection slightly forward towards perfection as we're trying to figure out the entire lay of the land. But Andrew is just a warrior working up there in the cold lands of New Brunswick. And it's like super special. And then you get these opportunities, Peter, where you get to do an interview with somebody like John Hattie and Tony Frontier. And, interviewing John Hattie is like getting to go to the Vatican and interviewing the Pope. And it was remarkable to me how much correction he provided to me about my own beliefs about education, and even, sacred cows that we all carry around. John disabuses us of those sacred cows pretty
Yeah,
strongly.
convincingly.
Right?
Yeah, pretty
Convincingly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a real joy to do this process. And it is all for us at What School Could Be. The North Star, the shining light, is student-driven learning, student agency, and real-world learning, relevant learning. And with AI coming into the picture now, maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that at some point. That's a major factor in that process. So we're trying to be agile and get into that and be part of that conversation as well.
I'd like to ask you a question that I ask every guest who comes on the podcast, and you just touched on it a little bit. I'd love to expand on it a little bit more. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Well, first of all, I want to be absolutely sure that your listeners understand that I have never been a principal. I've never been a school director. I've never been a superintendent. I've been none of those things. And in fact, prior to What School Could Be and the work that I'm doing directing the team right now, and even then I'm uncomfortable using the word directing because we are a full-blown team. That, having said that, I have not been in that position. I have had the privilege, mostly through the podcast, of really learning a great deal from education leaders, principals, school directors, school presidents, superintendents. And so the term, an imperfect leader really does resonate because I've heard their stories and I've been able to share those stories of moving slowly but surely from imperfection, one step at a time, towards something that's a little bit more like a more perfect union, a more perfect work that you're doing. And I'll share with you really quick that here in Hawaii, I have a separate What School Could Be initiative that is now 2 years underway. In Hawaiian, the term aha kuka means to gather and talk seriously. And we have something, I'm doing it with my nephew who works at Kamehameha Schools here in Honolulu. The aha kuka project brings together principals, school directors, public, private, charter every other month. And for an hour and a half, they get the opportunity to just talk with each other and build relationships with each other. And the really important part, Peter, is they select the topic. We don't. So we do a whole throw your topics on a page, vote on your topics, and then we'll decide what topic we're going to talk about. And so to your question about imperfection, wow, every single time we get together, I am blown away at how each of these leaders is navigating their way on this epic voyage of school leadership. And my goodness, on the one hand, on one end of the spectrum, Peter, they're just putting out fires, one fire after another all day long. At the other end of the spectrum is that kind of North Star mission and vision work in which they're literally moving their communities forward towards something that the whole community agrees needs to happen. And it's specific to place and culture. And so I love the term. It really does resonate because in the resonating, in the chance to talk to and elevate these leader stories, you see how human they are. They really are. And sometimes I think as a community, we forget how human they are. We treat them as if somehow they're robotic managers of what happens on campus. And they live through a lot of pain and they live through a lot of joy. It's the agony and the ecstasy all over again, as John Hattie and I talked about. And so it's a really special thing. And what you're doing to elevate that is wonderful, because it takes a lot of courage to talk about imperfections. And look at what Christina Kishimoto talked about. She lived through COVID and led our public school system here in Hawaii through COVID, but didn't survive COVID because just like, thousands of superintendents around the country, she got kind of run over by the whole COVID phenomenon and left. And I thought that was kind of tragic for the state because I thought that she was a wonderful superintendent.
We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And my guest today is Josh Reppun, the host and producer of What School Could Be podcast. Now, in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision they've made and then what they learned from it. So let's discuss it. Josh, what happened?
Wow, that's a loaded question, Peter.
Well, you did know I was probably going to ask it.
Yeah. So a number of years ago, when I was still teaching, I think it was between 2010 and 2014, It was my last stint as a teacher. And it was my third school that I was teaching at, Iolani School, which is a pretty large independent school here in Honolulu and pretty traditional by any metric, very much, college matriculation, Sterling scholarships, all of that sort of thing. So at that time, I had also about 5 or 6 years under my belt of ed tech work. So in addition to teaching history and US history, European history, and so on, I had become very much an ed tech kind of leader in the various campuses that I had been on. And so to make the long story short, at this campus, the powers that be on campus, the president, the CFO, a few other people, got it in their brains, Peter, that they wanted to build an innovation center on campus. So long story short, they went out, they toured California and some other states. They got some ideas. They came back, they employed an architectural firm, and they built this innovation center. It's called the Sullivan Center for Innovation and Leadership. And it's quite a building. Adam, I'm not sure if you've ever been to Stanford's D School, but it actually is very much like Stanford's D School because that's where they went to see innovation amongst other schools like Nueva. So I, at that time, was one of the very first people to occupy that building. And what I was doing with the new headmaster was building something called the EIL, which is the Education Innovation Lab. And at the very same moment, and this is the crux of the story, we decided that this thing called an iPad, we needed to go one-to-one with an iPad. And that meant 2,000 iPads, K through 12 or 1 through 12. So you get the Innovation Center, you get the iPad initiative, and you put that all together in a very traditional campus. And what we ended up with was blowback like you could not believe. And so when I look at my decision making in there, and really in some ways, Peter, I'll be very honest, this is what chased me out of education or chased me out of teaching, because the blowback was so intense that I was not emotionally ready as a leader of this EIL, as a co-director, to even handle that energy. And so I had dreams. Here's this beautiful space. I was going to train the faculty on deeper learning ways of using iPads because I'd already done that already, and so on and so forth. And they wanted nothing to do with it. In fact, in the end, they saw the iPad as maybe a lighter way of carrying a 20-pound textbook, right? It was that kind of thing.
It was just substitution.
It was substitution.
There was no innovation.
So I look back on that with some regret. And I've even, on my LinkedIn page, I've actually written some articles about the regret that I feel about that, because the faculty were never invited into the ownership of that.
That's what I was going to ask. So let me ask a question that typically, so if I understand correctly, I mean, you have a well-funded, well-resourced school that builds this incredible innovation building that you are tasked with as a teacher leader to create this education innovation lab, right? And as part of that lab and as part of the school, there's a decision to purchase 2,000 iPads for children 1st through 12th grade. And then you received a considerable amount of blowback that really resulted in you're moving in a different direction when it comes to influencing education. So typically we ask, what got overlooked? So tell us, what did get overlooked? It sounds like you started to talk about the involvement for teachers or of teachers.
Great question. So 2 things. On the Sullivan Center side, what got overlooked was the absolute necessity of co-ownership of a building like that. So those individuals who went out and toured the country and then came back and built the building did not really enroll the faculty in the ownership of the concept. And so to just plant something down that in the middle of a campus like that with a traditional kind of approach to education, that was a major oversight. That was a major overlook.
Yeah,
It
wow.
really blew it in some ways.
So there was not a shared image of how the space was going to be used and how it was going to...
No, it was like, the first time that the faculty actually were able to come into the building, it was as if going from Earth to Mars. They had no clue what could happen in there other than them conducting class in the way that they've always done it in a fancier environment. And for us in the EIL to try to convince them was an impossible task. So that's number 1. Number 2 is my personal involvement in the iPad initiative. So I had spent the year before with just 10 iPads that the new head of school had bought for me and I was team teaching US history at that point. So we were so far off the cutting edge, not only in the way that we were teaching US history, but using those iPads as a way to expand the research capabilities. Because kids on this campus were not allowed to have access to the internet, nor were they allowed to have any sort of mobile devices. So my regret in this situation, Peter, is that I was so enthusiastic about what I was doing in my classroom that I went straight to the headmaster, who I had his trust, and I was helping him develop the EIL in the Sullivan Center. And he immediately, snapped his fingers and said, okay, let's do it. Let's go one-to-one with the iPad. And, a few weeks later, we actually rolled them out to the entire faculty. I look back on that now and realize that was an incredible mistake. And what ended up happening is that I and a few other people who were involved in the initiative really in some ways got blamed for upsetting the apple cart in the most epic possible of ways. And yet my heart was in the right place. I was just maybe 6 or 7 years too early and wanting to do something like that. And so, so if for any education leader who's out there, and boy, if I learned this in the subsequent years since 2014, both through the podcast and all the work that I've done through What School Could Be, to your leaders who are listening to this show, it has to be blindingly obvious that ownership and agency and enrollment is part of anything that you're doing to change. It has to be, you have to develop, as my good friend and colleague Robert Landau talks about, a guiding coalition of faculty and of your community, your parents, your students, and you need to get everybody involved in moving the thing forward. And I'll say really quickly, one of my favorite episodes of my show is Richard Berner, who's the superintendent of the graded school in Sao Paulo. He took his entire school into deeper learning. And I think that episode is kind of the primer. It was the first time he'd been on a podcast. That's the primer for how to do it, because it was 100% enrollment by his entire community in moving through that process. That's the thing right there.
Well, that sounds marvelous. I would love to know if my mentor is familiar with his school at all, because the work that she did, her name is Linda Henke, and she's now in Santa Fe, but she took a school that was almost unaccredited, a district, and led it to a district of high distinction. And a big part of that was engaging initially in appreciative inquiry. What energizes us? What do we want for children? What that compelling purpose of what do we want to create together? Discussing and working together. And when I say together, I mean meeting with the people most impacted by those decisions. So children and parents and community that had distrusted the school district. In fact, in the local churches, they would advise to vote against tax increases for the schools because there was no real connection. She worked so hard to get to, and how do we want to be together? And then really engage in whether the middle schools, I think, were experiential learning. And then the high schools were just absolutely incredible. They were she was so intentional about artwork and sculptures that were placed that, the kids became curators of the school, as it was just in a marvelous, most hopeful place. So anyway,
can I add something really quick? And I want to go back to John Hattie again. What was such a revelation in reading Visible Learning and then interviewing John Hattie and his colleague, Tony Frontier, was there is a sequence to change. And here's the specific example, something that we talked about, Tony and John and myself in the episode. If you want to implement the use of AI because you believe rightly that it's going to be a 21st century skill, if you want to implement iPads because you believe that mobile technologies are some of the tools that you have to use in the future, and so on and so forth. If you did, as I did and my colleagues did at Eli School, just drop them into the middle of something, you're out of sequence. And so what John and I talked about was the movement from dependent learner to independent learner. And in that process, the slow implementation of technologies like AI, like mobile technologies, like all the things that are popping up all over the place, in the independency, then you get the magic as you move forward.
Makes sense.
A slow movement away.
Makes sense. If you are dependent on a sage on the stage and now you've given them all these tools to allow children to be self-engaged and self-driven, it is to your point of, you've all of a sudden dropped them on Mars and said, what do you think? We're here. We made it. Like, what?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, what did you learn about relationships?
Cool. That's a loaded question too. I'll give you a specific example that goes back, Peter, to the Sullivan Center for Innovation and Leadership in my education innovation lab. I convinced my head of school that I needed a couple of colleagues to work in the EIL. And so I picked a couple of teachers who were already on staff already, and we brought them into the EIL. And I thought, based on my limited knowledge of them at that point, that they were going to be my perfect clones, that they were Josh. And here's the first moment when I knew that things were going off the rails. In the EIL, much like the D school, I wanted no one to have a desk. I wanted no one to have a cubicle. It was like you work wherever the work needs to be done. These two individuals immediately set up their cubicles in the EIL and began populating it with photos of their kids and, so on. It became very territorial. And so to your question about relationships, I was not prepared to try to navigate building relationships with them that would ultimately get them to understand the magic of being able to work in an open environment like that. So you just take that one example and extrapolate it out. Learning how to build relationships is a lifelong process. And here I am, age 66, directing the What School Could Be enterprise right now. And finally, Peter, I feel like I'm ready to do the work as a leader, as a director, because it has taken me a lifetime to figure out how to build relationships. And a lot of it, I want to say right here, a lot of it is around gratitude. You just have to be building relationships with people as being grateful for what they bring to your life, not what you bring to theirs. And so it's a great question. And what's also important, Peter, specifically to your show, is the relationships that are built between superintendents amongst each other is huge for moving innovation forward. It's so hard to work alone. And when you have a collection of superintendents, some of the most magical work that I'm seeing happening is in Kansas City, the real world learning initiative that's unfolding there.
Yep.
That's
my
happening.
Friend David Buck is involved in that, and Jeremy Tucker in Liberty. The Kauffman Foundation is running it, but it's North Kansas City, Liberty, Lee's Summit, Blue Springs. They're doing some, because they were sort of I was in Columbia, Missouri. So I would travel to Kansas City to meet with Park Hill and all of them led by the Kauffman Foundation. Yeah, some of that work.
The relationships amongst those superintendents.
Yep, and then they have something called the CAPS North program. So children who spend half their day in their high schools and the other half the day in their internships that they applied and were interested in. And you start to interview children and ask them about, why'd you choose this? Because schools need to not be based on Carnegie units. They need to be based on what am I interested in? How can I get real world learning and go do it? And then when you talk to the businesses where they're working, whether it's the hospitals where they're working or whether they're in factories where it's high tech factory, not, conveyor belt factory. And they are talking about, hey, these kids are teaching us. We're saving so much money because of their different way of looking at things and being able to help us. It's so inspiring. Yeah, totally.
It is. Yeah. And it's all back to the relationships.
Yeah.
Between the leaders.
I love that. It's a good example. I hadn't thought of
vertical and horizontal.
Yeah.
The leadership. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Well, I often ask in the end, what was something that was good that came out of the situation? However, I feel like you just said it in terms of the ability now to influence in a different way and to begin to be that convener of good ideas and good best practices and promising practices that absolutely can influence what school could be.
If I can just share a quick story with you.
Please.
After that debacle that happened for me personally and professionally in the Sullivan Center, and I left teaching, and it was just really kind of a dark moment for me. And then I got started working retail as a way to just sort of keep moving forward. That's when I saw Most Likely to Succeed. And so my first screening of the film I did with my brother at an ecumenical community center out where we both grew up. And that was the moment, Peter, where the EIL was kind of reborn, except that it was through screenings of the film. And so you'd show the film and it's 90 minutes. So it's not easy to keep people to stay after 90 minutes. And that first screening, 200 people attended. I set up a whole seminar system for how to discuss the film. I was terrified they were all going to leave as soon as the film ended. No one left. Everybody stayed for another hour to discuss the film. And that was the EIL reborn for me. And so that's where my learning really began. And I'm very grateful to Ted for the film and the way that it impacted my life. And it's given me a pathway forward to continue to figure all these things out on the go as we move forward.
I love it.
Yeah.
Our guest today was Josh Reppun, the host and producer of What School Could Be podcast. And, as you were talking earlier, I had an image and a memory of one of my mentors in grad school, Pete Mesa. He had been the superintendent in Oakland, California. And he had really challenged us to move away from what had really become, and he had become entrenched in, that top-down accountability obsessed thinking. He would always sort of challenge us. Let's move away from this top-down accountability obsessed thinking.
Yeah.
And really getting to know you before our conversation, throughout this conversation, has just been incredibly inspiring. I mean, to gather and talk seriously, ahakuka means that those who come together to gather and to talk seriously must be willing to be vulnerable. And that is the whole premise of an imperfect leader. And then if I could maybe just tie it to your work in Hawaii, and I think of Hawaiian history, Polynesians who ventured into what was the unknown because they had an idea that they would arrive at something pretty promising, pretty beautiful, pretty hopeful. And this has been just an incredibly wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. This has been great. You've put fuel in my tank for months. Thank you.
If you're just joining us, you've just heard an amazing conversation. Is it getting annoying? That's usually when it gets even funnier.
Oh, it's something I feel like I see your comedy. I see where that goes. I see the direction it goes.
It's a callback or something. I don't know. So, but let's do it. Let's talk about this conversation.
Okay. Can I open with a question that I think will tie to Josh and his podcast particularly? And I'm like, I wish, Peter, what can school be? What seems innovative to you that isn't done enough? And I want to put a caveat around it because, there's innovative, high-tech high, and then I'm actually interested in the simple and doable innovative. What have you seen that someone could do tomorrow in your mind? How you define innovative?
Well, I think it's a tough question to answer. And the reason why is each district is in a different place for where they are. If I were in charge of a school again, or a school district again, I would be walking in with this lens of, we all want to create opportunities for kids. And so how do we do that in a way that removes the sort of the barrier of the four walls of a classroom being that's the only place where they learn? And I don't mean technology. I think we sometimes equate or conflate the idea of innovation to be technology.
Right.
I think if we can find ways to really embed place-based, project-based learning, so experiential learning that is very much in tune to what is the place or where do children live, what is that space, and then use that as a classroom. So I really want to see more examples of, I know you've heard me talk about Scott Nearing before. He really was talking about place-based, project-based learning. They don't have to rely only on textbooks to do their learning. They can use their place to all of those critical skills that we say are important. Collaboration, communication, critical thinking, although that sometimes gets a bad rep depending on what part of the country you're in, but to be really discerning and to be curious and creative. And so I think that becomes your pathway for it. And so wherever that school district might be in that continuum is where I would want to start and really want to see, is that something we all want to create together? If it's not, then that's not the place for me, because you can't force a vision onto a school district if it doesn't gel with its values or it's not open to exploring new ways of doing school.
Love that. I mean, what I love about your answer is, yes, I fully agree that there is contextual information that needs to be taken into account. Every school is different. Every community is different, all of that stuff. The one where the question came from in terms of my own experience was, I remember seeing a math teacher who put up whiteboards all around her room, the entire room covered in whiteboards, basically eliminated all the chairs and desks. And every student worked in small groups on standing up so that all of their work was public. And the teacher stood in the middle, constantly assessing, joining small groups and backing out, groups joining each other and backing out.
I love that. So that is it is distinct from what I said, and that's great, because I think what you're talking about are the instructional practices that you might find in this vision that I sort of explored with you. And that's to say that teachers serve as facilitators, as activators of knowledge, as guides on the side, as opposed to sage on the stage.
Yeah.
And so I just love that.
I fully agree with that. I also think what it allowed her to do was to really, it allowed every kid in the room to see other kids learning. And they benefited from the fact that other kids, like, this is the students talking to students about their learning. because there's more of their brains than there are of yours as a teacher. And so besides that, their schema is closer to each other than it is to yours. So if you were to give an example to the students, if it works, I usually describe that as luck. That's called luck because there's very little chance that they have anything in common with you. Very little chance. But what they have in common is with those kids around them.
Yes.
And that the better opportunity to get a metaphor from the kid to kid than from teacher to kid.
That's smart. That's true. So I want to turn this to Josh because he also gives advice, right? His after action review was all about, he had this innovation center that he was leading and he realized, and it actually drove him from the work because it blew up in his face when, in fact, the staff were not ready. They didn't even understand what the whole space was going to be around. And so he says, it has to be blindingly obvious that the ownership and agency and enrollment is part of anything that you're doing to change. And it has to be, you have to develop, as he said, his good friend and colleague, Robert Landau, talks about a guiding coalition of faculty and your community, your parents, your students, and you need to get everybody involved in moving the thing forward. And so I think that's where I say, well, it all depends on where on the continuum you are, and then seeing where we all can say, this is where we are, and then this is where we want to go next with this ultimate destination out there in the future. I think he's right. I think we all know that. We sometimes get blinded by, in this case, he had this beautiful new building. He had this great, and he saw when these people he recruited to work with him, and they're all setting up their cubicle and putting up their family photos. And he was like, uh-oh, we don't have a shared image of what this place can look like.
Well, I actually had a thought in relation to this that made me wonder. I loved his after action review. I thought it was really interesting and a consistent dilemma across public systems. And that is, you send a person or small team to something, they get super inspired, they come back to the district, and it fails miserably because the system isn't inspired. The system isn't changed. In fact, what you have to do is basically inspire people to you either have to mandate that they all go to the thing. And once you mandate it, the inspiration level just dropped a bit. So, or the people that came back have to be inspiring, which led me to the leader part of this. What does it take to be that inspiring leader? Because I think for some, they can totally do it. It makes me think of the people that you and I have said when we've listened to the podcast, I'd work with that person in a heartbeat. They're inspiring. What is it that makes them that way? And how do you practice that? How do you get better at that?
I do think you have to be an excellent storyteller because you can't tell people, this is going to be great for us. You really have to craft this vision. It's almost like when you say to someone, okay, I want you to think about 3 years from now, and there's a newspaper reporter waiting outside your door, and they're saying, hey, how'd you do it? How'd you get there? And that's where you start to cast back on, this is what I said we did, and this is how we got there. And you start to cast this story for others. And so someone like Josh or others that we've talked to in the past, they really do. They capture your heart more than anything. And there's something that you do. I thought about you yesterday. I was part of a group that convened 10 superintendents from different states all around the country. And we were asking for some advice as part of some of the work that I do for an ed tech company. And there was great interaction between and among the superintendents around crafting a vision about doing this work and being able to communicate it well. And there was one in particular who really talked about, and this is what I thought about you and something that Josh mentioned as well, is bringing students along to co-create what that's going to look like. Everyone gets excited when kids are excited about what something could look like for them. And you do that so well in the work that you do in terms of really helping the adults see what kids see so that they may begin to shift their own behaviors, because they don't always do it because they know that it's the right thing to do, but because the people that they're responsible for are craving a different approach. And so I think that's also one way that leaders do that, is that they really do hone in on what kids are telling them that they want.
Funny. That's one of his 5 themes. He says the 5 themes for this innovation are mobilizing your community, student-driven learning, real-world challenges and assessments for deeper learning, and caring and connected communities. I love these themes. They're broad, but one of them being specifically student-driven learning. And it makes me think of the ways in which we use students to drive systemic change. The easiest being ask them what they think,
Yes.
and
Right.
collect that data. Just
And
collect
doing
the
it
qualitative
seriously,
data.
not where you're just bringing some kids together, doing it intentionally, thoughtfully. Who are the students that you're bringing? Are they a cross section of your community? And almost like Josh talked at the Aha Kuka initiative, right? Coming together to talk seriously and support each other in what is an imperfect journey for all of them.
He says, this is the thing that I think that makes Josh. I actually don't think necessarily Josh is the storyteller. Josh is the conveyor of stories, much like this podcast is. You and I aren't really the storyteller here. It's the guest that we want to be the storyteller. So we end up being the spotlight or the physical stage or the stage manager or whatever metaphor that you
No, I
use
love the
there.
metaphor because we've talked about that we get to stand, sit in the mezzanine and see all these things sort of unfold.
Yes.
And sometimes it's messy when the choreography is not right or you get too many people on the stage. I love even what's off stage. How does it all even happen? Right? Because there are things that are unseen that are totally responsible for what's unfolding.
He says, I think one of the things that I would love to see in the future is an embrace of the variations that we have been living in a standardized education process for more than 140 years. And it's actually in the variations, in those differentiated models, that we will find the answer. And he says, people have called me naive in my relentless optimism, but I'm optimistic and I see the cup as half full. I think we're actually headed in the right direction, that we are moving very, very quickly now towards student-driven learning.
I heard that again recently as I was re-listening to our conversation and was wondering, does he still feel that way even, it's been a couple of months since I talked to him and with everything happening. And I think he would probably say, yes, I remain optimistic because what's the alternative?
You started with the movie thing, with the movie question of what movie. I know there's no movie that inspired me, but it does make me think of Jurassic Park, where he says, what does he say? Life persists, or life finds a way. That's what he said.
Okay.
Life finds a way. Innovation finds a way. That no matter the repression, it's difficult. And as a result, as exampled by this very conversation, that we're like, we like this one thing, we like that one thing. They're little things, little flowers growing, but it's not a garden yet. We haven't done that yet. And he's saying, let's try and create a garden. There are flowers everywhere. We just need to amplify the flowers.
I like that as a metaphor too.
Thanks.
Thinking about ornamental gardens that one just plants and has no soul. And then those who are really thoughtful of the seasons and when things bloom and how to attract bees and whatever it is, that it can be a really beautiful place when it's really well considered.
Who would you say is the most inspiring leader that you've been connected to in your life?
Well, I still think it's my mentor, Linda Henke.
Yeah.
She really, when I went to visit her district while she was still superintendent, we walked the halls of her high school with the sculptures and the artwork, and she bought real pieces of real value to say, this is a really special place where she'd been there 13 years. It took forever to really work all together to create it. It was a beautiful old building that they refinished the beautiful wood and said to kids, you deserve the very best places. And our middle schools, it's all going to be about experiential learning and field trips. And our elementary school, she reminded that she almost got fired because she got a goat for the school, for the elementary school. And the board was like, you bought a goat? And he was like, yes. So she was probably the most inspired and inspiring. And I still stay very close to her high school principal, who was National Urban High School Principal of the Year, Kevin Grauer, who does listen to the podcast. So if you're just joining us, Kevin, it's good to see you.
I hope
but it's
Kevin,
true.
He did just join us. He tuned in right at that moment.
Right at that point. Exactly. Kevin is a pretty inspired person as well. So yeah, I would say those are the people.
I wonder what our listeners would say is that person for them. Like who's
it for you? Yeah, I love the fact that you asked me that question, and I need to throw it back to you because no doubt you've worked with some pretty inspiring people. So not who's the most, I'll ask, give an example of one that really, and why did they inspire you?
Gosh, so I'm going to speak to two people, both of which that give me the opportunity to sit here today. There's no way I am who I am without sitting here today. And that isn't to say that there are other people within that organization that didn't contribute to that. But one is Glenn Singleton, who I got to work with coming out of the school system, doing courageous conversations around race and specifically leading the workshop Beyond Diversity. I got my understanding of how to talk and facilitate conversations about race because of Glenn. He's one of the most inspiring speakers I've ever had the opportunity to be partnered with. And then number two, it's LaShawn Route Chapman at National Equity Project, who I begged to give me a job. And she approaches leadership from a humanistic point of view, from a point of view that says you coach people to be better people for the sake of others. And it took me a while to learn that lesson. Like, yeah, I did not go into working with her with that lesson. I thought I had it, but no, I was not good. And it took me a long time of practice to learn that lesson. And still to this day, it is the thing I devote my life to. So I'm inspired by the learning that Glenn gave me, but my approach is influenced by LaShawn.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I hope if you're just joining me,
Peter has left.
Pete got to turn off the recording. So we're just going to riff for the next 3 hours.
Here's one more thing that I was thinking about from the conversation.
Yeah.
You never know how an interaction with one person may lead to something else. And the example of just like being in the Apple store and this idea popped into his brain. He's talking to this guy who happens to know how to do podcasts, and then they create what could school look like in Hawaii. And then it turns into seeing this 90-minute film, and it just absolutely, and he says, I'm telling you, it just changed my life. And then the two of them started building this whole network. And like, that's pretty cool to me. Is I think so often, particularly the generation of young adults, people in their 20s and even early 30s, they think and maybe all of us, we think we're planning towards something and that's how it's got to go. And we need to also recognize and embrace that life is not a direct line, that it's this almost serpentine, circuitous. Things happen. I mean, you and I, like, we met just based on, like, I read an article that you and Greg had written, and I was like, hey, would you guys be willing to be on the podcast? And then you got on before Greg, and we're just like having so much fun. Poor Greg was like, do I need to be?
I almost felt like our paths were just so intertwined. I'm like,
and then we parallel played for a long time, and so kind of neat. So anyway, I thought that was pretty interesting. Is that here he is, all these years later, and just by taking a leap of faith. And I think that was a takeaway that I had was be willing to take a leap of faith. You don't know what's going to happen, and that's okay.
Yeah, I've said this before, and I'll say it again right here, right now. And that is that for me, this is some of the best learning I've done is in this podcast, which out of the blue, it came out of the blue. And not only did I gain you as a partner and friend, but I learn every week. It's something new and inspirational or something I'm thinking about. And as a result, it has me go down this other rabbit hole. And now I'm reading about this or that. And that is better PD than I've had in ages, because I probably had a mindset that PD is something you go to, or we bring someone in. And I've had some inspiring PD sessions like that, professional learning like that. But this, like, what?
You'll love this. I met a professor of educational leadership who assigns 5 of our episodes and has people listen to them, and then they talk in small group about it. All right, I think we have enough for today.
Yes, that was great. Josh was great. Listen to his podcast.
You should. And if you're just joining us, you've missed the entire episode.
But we're happy you're here.
We are. You have been listening to almost 4 seconds of An Imperfect Leader, Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. I'll see you next week, Jamie.
I'll see you next week. Actually, before we run off, remember to remind people, please give us a 5-star review. It helps in the podcast ratings. Please feel free to leave any comment that you want. I am really appreciative of those that comment on the lengthy blather that we have just engaged in. But I'd be interested in any comment that you have to say, but always make it 5 stars.